And in a hunt for money, there were a couple of cases that came up to the Supreme Court. Seattle School District versus the state in 1975, and then the McClary case, 2007 was filed. So the decision the Supreme Court made in Seattle versus the state sort of set a foundation for all of this. It was a basic principle. It said, okay, the state is setting educational requirements, therefore, the state has an obligation to help the school districts meet those requirements. Because it says ample provision for the education of all the children. If the state defined what that meant, then the state had to ante up. But the schools simply were not getting enough state revenue to do that. And they were running excess levy elections in order to make up the difference. So just like you're raising money for the local school district, there was taxing going on. The legislature had as a basis for the Seattle School District decision until 1979 to provide adequate funding. And the McClary resolution didn't happen until 2018. So it really has been going on for a long, long time. It's not a new thing. McClary versus the state in 2012 ruled that Washington was not meeting Article 9. We all know that, right? And the legislature was told to provide the funds and not rely on the districts doing excess tax levies. The legislature, oddly enough, the legislature could not quite agree on how to do that. I know that's a shock. By 2014, the Supreme Court said, we're not waiting any longer. They started fining the state $100,000 a day, held the state in contempt for not fulfilling its obligation to pay for basic education. McClary, in 2015, the legislature then came up with $1.3 billion. It's a change. But the McClary plaintiffs said to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed, that that wasn't enough. And the McClary plaintiffs were asking for $5 billion, about 4 times what the legislature was offering. There was endless back and forth in this period. I couldn't begin to remember everything that happened here with the back and forth. But finally, this year, it seemed like everything was going to be okay. Everything was resolved. The magic McClary decision had been funded. Well, that maybe hasn't worked out so well, and that's why we're here today. The key to the legislative solution was a set of very complicated mechanics about funds, how funds would get distributed, and I think that's maybe going to be a big part of the discussion today. So, we have on the agenda the idea of framing up the issue, and we have 2 speakers that are going to do that. Slade, what is the problem here? I mean, there's all this money from McClary. Why aren't we all feeling great about it?
Right. So there's several aspects to the impacts of McClary. One of the things that happened in McClary was they eliminated the state salary schedule, and so that left each district to bargain with their bargaining units their own salary schedule. The way we were funded earlier was that we had a staff mix, which meant that if you had a new teacher with a certain level of education and X number of years, the state would give us money for that position. And if you had a more experienced teacher with more education, the state would then give us money for that educator. So a typical maybe first-year teacher or new teacher might be around the $40,000 mark. We would get that allocation from the state. We had a teacher that with more experience, with more education, maybe in the $75,000 salary range, the state would give us that money. And there was a schedule for all the teachers to be on. And with McClary, they eliminated the salary schedule and they also eliminated the staff mix. And so they give us an amount, a fixed amount, regardless of if that teacher is a new teacher or if that teacher is a more experienced teacher or more educated. And so Vashon, at this point in time when they made that switch, we were kind of sitting in the middle. So not that kind of didn't have a huge impact on us. But as every year goes on, as our teachers become more experienced, and we want them to get their master's degree, we want them to further their education, those teachers begin to cost our district more, but yet our allocation does not go up. So that was eliminating the staff salary schedule and eliminating staff mix. That had lots of districts, including ours, questioning about how we're going to be able to sustain ourselves through these impacts. One of the other things that the public may or may not understand is that there's a prototypical funding model, which means the state says if you have X number of students, you're going to get this many principals, you're going to get money for this many teachers, you're going to get this much money for school psychologists, for school nurses, and on it goes. Most districts will agree probably with this analysis that prototypical model, school districts do not operate on that prototypical model. For example, right now I think for Vashon we're allocated money for a 0.5 school psychologist because of our school numbers. And so we have 2 school psychologists because we need 2 school psychologists to be able to do all the work that's needed to support the teachers and identifying students who will receive special services. So along with school nurses, teachers, so Vashon right now currently, again, along with, I would probably say 100% of the districts, the 295 districts in our state, program their schools far above and beyond what the prototypical model is. So, so that's part of our ongoing issue. The way we've been funding those positions is through the use of levies, something that Rick alluded to earlier. So when we go for a levy to our community, that levy typically is paying mostly for the extra staffing that we're providing in our schools, kind of what Bev talked about, what the community has come to expect, again, not dissimilar to other districts. The other issue is that the state, in an effort to provide equity amongst the districts and to take into account the cost of living for some of these higher cost of living districts like Bellevue, like Washington, Seattle, they began to do what they call regionalization. If you're familiar with what that name has been in the papers a lot recently, because of the kind of inequity that has resulted from the regionalization. So just to give you an example, in our area right now, 18% is the most common regionalization for districts like Seattle, Highline. So essentially every district in our area, with the exception of Federal Way and Tacoma, and our district, we're at 12%. And what that means is that in addition to the regular base funding, those districts get an extra 18% in their apportionment. Vashon gets an additional 12%. And so that equates to about a $650,000 difference in what a district like Highline or Seattle or Renton or the other districts in our area, what they receive versus what Vashon receives. And there's a unique it's a unique experience being on island, and as I've learned to understand these dynamics a little bit better, it is